Right, well, welcome back to the afternoon sessions. We've got quite a few speakers on our next panel, so I'm going to be brief. The aspect that I've been most impressed about with Rachel McCrory's Working Party and Working Paper series, which we're going to be hearing about today, has been the emphasis on different academic disciplines working together. So historians bringing their perspectives on how work-life balance has changed over centuries, and looking at these phenomena at a society level rather than just focused on the individual, which is something that it's very easy to get caught up in with these issues that affect all of our lives. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rachel and her very beautifully designed slides.
Thanks, Rosie. Great, so I'd like to welcome you to the Daily Life, Digital Technologies and Energy Demand panel session. I'd like to start actually by saying I know it's been a sobering few days, and the EU referendum outcome may well have repercussions for the very topic that we're discussing and the network through which this working paper collection has been produced, but I very much hope that we can come together this afternoon and be involved in a stimulating discussion here today. So this set of networking activities has been sponsored by the Balance Network, kindly, and supported by the Urban Institute at Sheffield University, to whom we'd like to extend our thanks. So the main rationale for these activities emerged from the juncture of several trends: increasingly flexible working practices, rising levels of home working, growing investment in the digital technologies sector, and a concurrent surge in the use of digital devices for automating, monitoring, and remotely managing domestic and work practices. These trends are set against political drivers to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions across residential and commercial sectors, and yet they often lead to variable and unintended energy performance results. While digital technologies are often advertised as enabling more inclusive, convenient, and manageable everyday life, mounting evidence points to their deployment exacerbating daily stresses and reinforcing socio-political divides. And research and design underpinning digital energy management technologies tends to frame users as rational decision makers, so individuals who will act in their own economic best interest when people's everyday lives are in reality far more complex than this. So given this, we set out to interrogate the changing rhythms, routines, and relationships associated with increasing adoption of digital technologies into domestic and work practices. And we sought to understand the implications for the organisation of everyday life, patterns of energy demand, and personal well-being. So the process that we embarked on then, we held a 2-day workshop at the Urban Institute in Sheffield last November, in which 11 early career researchers participated. And they, as Rosie mentioned, represented very different disciplinary perspectives from geography, sociology, anthropology, environmental history, psychology, product design, mathematics, and the modelling of real-world phenomena. And we had valuable input during the workshop as well from the Centre for Sustainable Energy and the Association for the Conservation of Energy, from BEMA, who represent the interests of a collection of trade associations in the energy and power industry, and the Energy Technologies Institute. And the workshop produced a huge array of really interesting research ideas and enabled us to then team up as co-authors to deliver 6 working papers around 6 questions. So then through 4 discursive webinars and a peer review process involving both practitioners and more experienced academics, we're now able to present this working paper collection to you today. And you should all have a copy of the abstracts and a link to the Balance Network website where the collection is available for download. So I do hope that you really give the articles a good read, and we welcome any comments. And at this point, I'd like to thank my co-editor, Faye Wade, who's just sitting there on the 3rd row, and co-organisers Catherine Buchanan and Roxana Morisanu, who've helped enormously with the organisation of logistics of these activities, as well as having provided great intellectual support. And so I want to hand over now to our esteemed panel to provide 5 minutes of their reflections on the working paper articles. And first, I have to give my apologies on behalf of Dr. Yolanda Strengers, who's unfortunately ill today and not able to be with us. But she sent through some notes, so I'll read those on her behalf. Okay, so if I hand over to Matt then. And Matt's research is concerned with understanding social change in relation to sustainability through a focus on everyday life and the socio-technical systems that shape it. So Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
And Faye will indicate when you've got 5 minutes left.
Thank you. Well, it's good to see you all, and thank you very much, Rachel, for inviting me along today and for giving me the opportunity to read the papers that resulted from your network. So, as Rachel said, I'm at Sheffield. Part of my role is with the Demand Centre, which is a large research centre based at Lancaster, over 5 years trying to understand the dynamics of energy demand. So that's really where I'm coming from with this and the focus on that. And of course, energy demand has changed radically over a few generations. There's changing systems of provision that brought wood, then coal, and gas, then electricity have been part of radical changes in social organisation. It's part of that, of course, is dependent upon the appliances that came along with that. But those systems of provision of the utilities, the rise of those appliances, sort of labour-saving devices, for example, entertainment, mobility technologies, they can only happen in concert with changes to the detail of everyday life, the rhythms, the norms, the expectations of our daily lives. So most of the papers in the collection that we're discussing today are very much about the detail of such changes in the UK today, around digital, around smart technologies. Things that we can see in our own lives and the society around us are reshaping parts of our lives. Much of this within the papers is about processes of redistribution, if you like, of different aspects of what people do between people and technologies, sometimes between technologies and technologies. Processes of delegation, say, of work with labour-saving devices, of knowledge sometimes. We delegate knowledge, for example, to the internet. Arguably also delegation of responsibility, and that might be something that comes in with, say, smart technologies, delegating responsibility from the individual to the technology through an engineering approach. That's a process that's been going on for decades. That's so much the story of the changes to energy provision, appliances, and everyday life is often the story of delegation from the person to the machine to provide parts of activities. So in the papers I was specifically asked to address, we've each been asked to focus on 2 out of the papers in the collection. Oh, thanks. Sorry. So the first one was written by Janine Morley and Rosalind Robertson, very much engaging with these stories of delegation around popular discourses of the modern malaise of addiction to mobile digital devices, these ideas that we're increasingly addicted to habitually checking them. But in that paper, Janine and Rosalind push beyond these often quite individualistic accounts of addiction to look at the many ways in which these devices become assimilated into our lives individually through the material form of the devices, of course, their portability, about their tactility, the way that they attract us to engage with them, if you think about how touch screens changed how we worked with digital technology. But also going beyond that individual focus with the technology to looking at how the practices of our lives become reshaped to a dependence upon these technologies, the way that the provision of services, of information, of opportunities to participate in the public domain are increasingly integrating these technologies at a societal level as part of our dependence upon them. So in these kinds of technologies, in smartphones, you can see the radical kinds of changes that are often hoped for more broadly in terms of things like smart energy technologies, things that can radically reconfigure life. Can they reconfigure our lives to be less dependent upon energy or particular forms of energy? However, while it's easy to see that kind of change we've experienced ourselves with digital technology, it's important as well to be aware of continuities. And in the other paper that was asked to focus on by Leona and Roxana, it stands out in the collection in terms of not being about contemporary change, but rather drawing out continuities, looking particularly at the narratives of the changing balance between work and home that we're so much focusing on today as a result of digital technology, comparing that to the way in which work and home were configured in pre-industrial England, and really drawing out continuities of ways of life over that centuries-long perspective. And pointing out those continuities is really important. It's very easy to be distracted by the radical changes, the things that we identify ourselves in our own lives, for example. But it's really important to be aware of the continuities of things that drag us down in terms of slowing down the changes that we might like to see. And it's only by understanding the detail of how these changes happen, as studies in this collection of papers do, really try to understand the detail of how change is happening today. It's only through doing that that we can really hope to engender the kind of change we need in terms of energy, sustainability, and well-being. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Matt. And so, yeah, I'd like to hand over to Tom now. And Tom's a lecturer in environmental science and policy at UEA.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Rachel. And like Matt, I want also to thank you for inviting me to comment on the working paper series. It's a really, really excellent collection of papers, and I strongly urge everyone in the audience to engage with it. I think they're available free, aren't they, Rachel, over in the policy, certainly online. Really richly thought-provoking collection, well worth a read, and I think there's lots of scope in there for further development, and that's perhaps a little bit what I want to reflect on today about where should we take this sort of work. So the first paper I was asked to comment on was by Chris Folds and Roxana Morisanu. They focused on digital smart home products and their promise to control the busyness of everyday lives. And the core argument really of what they were saying, for me at least, was that the manner in which these digital or smart technologies seek to do this, to control busyness, is through a series of minor tweaks to help reorganize our existing schedules and activities. And therefore, the irony that Chris and Roxana point out is that in doing that, in focusing in that way, they do very, very little to question what those activities are in the first place, whether it is indeed desirable to do them quicker or more conveniently. And they actually do very little indeed to make those activities easier to perform. They might make them easier to organise and schedule, but not helping in terms of how we perform them or how long that might take. And in so doing, Chris and Roxana argue that these smart technologies serve, rather than reducing busyness, they serve to normalise it as a way of being, and thus any time that they might help us save is likely then to be taken up with other ways of being busy. They make being busy seem a desirable thing to be, and they help us be busier. So Chris and Roxana conclude that smart technologies are facilitating busy lifestyles rather than counteracting them, and that in so doing they're normalising business and actually accelerating life even further. And in response, and this is where I think the paper gets very interesting, Chris and Roxana ask, well, what might be done differently? How could we design technologies in other ways to redirect lifestyles, to slow things down? They ask, and it's a question I think we should all confront, what might it mean to develop something like a slow smart home or something like that, which actually really questions where we're going rather than just trying to get somewhere quicker. Which brings me then to the second paper by Faye Wade and Ida Nilstadt-Pettersson on the ideas of users and their lifestyles. And they look really at how it is that users get embedded into smart, in this case, heating controls through the images and assumptions that designers have about them. And the core theme in this paper for me is the assumptions that are made about users and whether they're accurate or not, how they are made and so on. And what they argue is that in the case of smart heating controls, although it's certainly true for a whole range of other smart and digital technologies, these things are designed often with little or, in fact, no interaction or consultation with users themselves. And further, that they're often then installed into people's homes in ways that aren't based on any real information about how people might want to use them, what they want to use them for, and what people's wider lifestyles are like. And as a result, a whole set of untested assumptions, erroneous assumptions get built into these technologies, get programmed into them, which ends up meaning, as we've all probably experienced at different times, that these technologies are either unlikely to be used in an optimal or smart way as their designers intend, or worse, probably not used at all and get chucked out for being more frustrating, more trouble than they are worth. And so what? So in essence, what Faye and Ida call for is closer engagement between users in design processes. How is it that users can be engaged in the process of designing these sorts of technologies? And critically, they argue this goes beyond simply surveys that understand consumer motivations or attempts to encourage users to accept technologies in different ways or in new ways, but rather to go towards forms of co-design, improved forms of field testing of technologies to really understand how it is they are or more often are not taken up in everyday lives. But just to sound a note of caution, and this is what I want to conclude on as well, I think that this can't be done in a narrow instrumental sense. User engagement, getting people to think about technologies they're using and how they're using them, needs to be about more than simply increasing the rate of diffusion or accelerating the smart or digital revolution. I think we need to take a much longer term and wider scale view of the social effects of these sorts of technologies, thinking about how it is they serve to create particular categories of user, how it is they seek to normalise particular ways of living, and whether or not that's desirable. So in short, what I guess I'm saying, and what I think this working paper collection shows time and again, is that smart or digital technologies seem to be very, very good at trying to make existing ways of living more efficient or convenient, but far too often fail to ask wider, more foundational questions about whether or not those ways of living are desirable in the first place. So I suppose the central challenge that this working paper series poses, at least for me, and which remains unaddressed, is what needs to be done to open up these bigger questions. Rather than how can we get somewhere quickly, I think we need to think about designing technologies that are perhaps wise rather than slow. And I think the key difference then between wise rather than smart, the key difference perhaps between a wise and a smart technology is that a wise technology would perhaps help us as a society actively and reflexively confront the big questions about where we're going, whether that's desirable, who wins and loses in that process, and actually therefore help us to try and get somewhere we want to go. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tom. Okay, and now I will quite literally hand the baton over to Nick, who is a Senior Development Manager at the Centre for Sustainable Energy in Bristol.
Thank you. So CSE is a national charity which researches solutions to sustainable and equitable energy use. It's also a practitioner employing around 10 full-time energy advisors who man the phone lines and visit people in their homes and try and give some guidance on how they should use energy more wisely. So we're very pleased to come today to give some perspective on the papers from a kind of practitioner's perspective. So many of our clients are on low incomes and vulnerable to cold, so it's really important that they master their heating controls and use energy wisely, which doesn't mean actually using less energy necessarily, but just using it better. And so when I asked the question of my colleague here, Mark, about what volume of his work, his energy advice work, is related to heating controls, this is what he told me. He actually said, well, actually, about 70% of our work is about giving people advice on how to use their heating controls. And people do struggle to control their heating. For example, thermostats are used as on-off switches, which leads to overheating and to underheating. Heating schedules are not aligned with occupancy. And not only that, we also find that when we do give people energy advice, how to get better at managing your energy consumption through mastering your heating controls, that advice is often not taken. And could one reason for that be related to the design of the heating control itself? So this is where the papers that I've been asked to look at have some interesting things to say. So Wade and Pedersen, and I think I've reviewed the same paper as you, but that's fine. Wade and Pedersen discuss how the designer of heating controls, or the scripting, there's a kind of scripting in the way that heating controls are designed and the way that they're commissioned or set up. And that assumes that there are particular lifestyles and capacities for the people that they're designed to help. And these may not align very well with how actual users behave. And we'd agree with that, particularly in respect of three aspects. So the interface for these kinds of devices has a design script which says, I'm a very complex piece of functional control technology that is part of the house's operating system and requires a considerable investment of mental effort to use effectively. And it assumes that the users can physically see these tiny, dim little numbers and symbols. Many people that are kind of visually impaired or elderly would struggle with that. And that they also assume that they share the designer's control logic and can therefore cope with these sort of frustrating and complex menu systems. The programmable thermostat assumes as well that households have a kind of regular and stable lifestyle, which the heating schedule can be matched to. But we find that many households that we work with don't have such regular kind of occupancy patterns and may have quite actually chaotic lives. And in those circumstances, a set heating schedule becomes an inconvenience, which needs to be continually overridden so that heat is delivered when it's needed. Many of our clients are also social housing tenants. And when the tenancy is taken on, the system is set up for them. And as Wade and Pedersen describe, at that time, the householder may be initially asked their preferences. How do you want this system set up? But frequently, households are then told, don't mess with the system now that it's been set up, because otherwise it will come out of balance. Just leave it as it is. And again, that means that when the schedule doesn't end up matching people's occupancy and lifestyle, they'll have to resort to overriding it continually to reset it to what they need. Now, smart thermostats have a very different script. This is the Hive system. And they say, I am a beautifully designed gadget that is integrated within a suite of other internet-enabled technologies which are necessary to access my fun scheduling interface, complete with cool animations. And that's my fun scheduling interface, because this is my very own smart thermostat I'm showing you here. I was going to actually do a link and show you how brilliant it was at being able to change the settings remotely. But my wife's at home today, working at home, and I don't want to sort of plunge her into a cold situation or heat her up unnecessarily either. So we'll just leave that. So Wade and Pedersen describe these types of smart technology as open because they appear more flexible and less scripted. But in fact, although the interface is undoubtedly easier to work with, the tech is just as scripted in some ways as the dumb thermostat. It assumes a kind of tech-savvy user who needs a lot of flexibility to sort of perfectly control and tune their comfort requirements from any location. And many of our clients, particularly the older ones, would be put off by the innovation here and the apparent complexity of the system. And smartphone and ownership of the internet is clearly something that's mainly linked to age groups. So older groups would be less likely to have the hardware to use this system. I've been told to finish off there.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay, so I'll just skip through. Oh, I was going to show you a nice picture of how that makes you happy.
It's all right, because I can run through Yolandi's notes quickly.
Okay. All right, so I just wanted to finally mention that we're actively exploring in CSE how we can use this sort of sensing technology to help with our energy advice. And this is a tool that we've developed to do that. You put temperature, humidity sensors around the home, and it can tell you a very rich and interesting picture about how the home is performing energy-wise. We've been taking this interface into people's homes and using it to help with our energy advice, and we're finding it a very effective tool. So I just wanted to finish on that. It's the Chariot project.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nick. Okay, so I'll just quickly run through Yolandi's notes. So Yolandi's Vice Chancellor's Senior Research Fellow and co-leader of the Beyond Behaviour Change Research Group at RMIT University in Melbourne. And these are her words, so I'll try and make sense of them. She says it's a fantastic collection of papers, which makes clear the visions, scripts, logics, rationales, and power struggles implicit in digital and smart technologies. The collection makes these visions visible, and in so doing, highlights the hidden work that they do. It also problematizes the dominant vision of individual responsibility, which is often embedded in digital technologies, where ideas of personalization, customization, smart control, and consumer choice take the fore. So then she goes on to talk about Leona Skelton and Roxana Morisani's paper, which is Qualities of Time. And they show how self-sufficiency was normal and necessary in the 17th century, but is a choice in the 21st century. And how then also talks about Janine Morley's paper. Janine and Rosie's paper, who show how problems with digital technology, for instance, addiction, so this is the Nation of Addicts paper, are commonly framed as an individual problem and a personal responsibility requiring detox programs, for example. She says that the real value of the working papers is illuminating the effects, assumptions, and implied ways of life that are embedded in digital technologies, and talks to Chris Folds and Roxana's paper, which shows how smart home discourses promise to make life simpler and to better manage busyness, but in actual fact, they may increase busyness and the speed of life. Similarly, Catherine Buchanan and colleagues, so this is the Are You In or Are You Out paper, shows how inclusive and exclusive features of digital technologies contain assumptions about wellness which are more mixed and varied in reality. And Wade and Peterson show how heating technologies contain scripts about how users can and should behave, which are complicated and sometimes thwarted as technologies enter the home. And then the final paper that hasn't yet been discussed is McCrory et al., which on this paper is Cracking the Code. So Yolandi suggests that this paper shows how algorithms are not neutral, but may reinforce or disrupt and steer existing routines and patterns of practice. So the authors look at 3 areas where algorithms perform automagical work. Reinforcing existing patterns of heating practices by learning habits through the Nest thermostat, steering TV watching practices, and they look at smart TVs, and targeting and potentially excluding problematic drivers, or providing education for making driving more fuel economic. So that's looking at assisted vehicles. And they also raise a series of critical questions about how can we make this work of algorithms and the power dynamics embedded within them visible. So then talking about the overall research working paper collection, she says, another critical question raised by the series is what role research and researchers can play in disrupting codes and imagining new ones. The working paper series already starts to do this by simply pointing out the hidden well-being and energy demand impacts of digital technologies. But we could go further to ask what automagical work researchers and others can and should do. We could do this by revealing the assumptions and hidden effects researchers have, but we could also start to more deliberately seek to reimagine and disrupt smart technologies or digital technologies and algorithmic assumptions. So, for instance, by reimagining busyness, talking to Fold's paper, by taking inspiration from the past, so that's the Skelton-Morrisano paper, by rethinking comfort, which Faye Wade and also the McCrory et al. Paper talk to, by experimenting with alternatives, or Yolandi also talks about her own work here, which is by proposing other forms of wellness and pleasure which take us towards a better work-life balance and lower energy demand. So she's looking at the concept of pleasance at the moment in smart homes. And she finishes her comments by saying thanks again for a fantastic collection and apologies for not being able to make the panel in person. Okay, so we'll move on now to take some of these reflections, which I'd like to thank all the panellists for their really helpful comments and for sharing your own experiences from the field as well. And also, as is the role with research, for posing some new questions and opening things out and suggesting that we develop things further, which is very much appreciated. And I'd like to pick up on some of these now in our panel session. So we've got 10 minutes, and then after which, well, depending on how we're getting along with our discussion, we'll open up to the floor with some questions. So please have a think about some questions you might want to ask the panel. And really, there's kind of a whole raft of different questions that could be posed, I think, from this collection. But what we have spoken about, what seems to be the most pertinent and the kind of logical step coming out of this working paper is really thinking about the implications of this research. or these sort of position papers, and thinking about what the priorities are then for research, for policy and for practice in transitioning to a less energy dependent and more balanced everyday life, which has greater personal well-being. And so I'd like the panel to talk to that, either picking up on energy demand reduction or personal well-being or reorganisation of everyday life, whichever you feel more comfortable discussing. But yeah, so first of all, should we think about what do you think the priorities for research are that jump out at you from having read the papers that you've been allocated in the working paper collection? We'll just have kind of an open discussion about this. Who would like to go first?
Oh, you go, Tom. Yeah, go on.
I mean, I guess where I would focus on that, focusing on research, I mean, the first thing I suppose I would say is I'm not sure how helpful it is to divide research policy and practice here, and actually part of the value of this network today has been bringing those audiences together. But of course, having said that, I'll then say things that might apply more strongly to researchers. I mean, from my analysis and looking across these working papers, but also my own research, what we have, particularly with respect to energy demand, but in lots of other areas of smart and digital technologies, are technologies that have enormous potential, but that end up not being used badly, or as in many cases, ending up making us feel more busy rather than less busy, or in a huge irony in relation to last week's event, technologies that promise to give you control back, but actually end up taking it away and render you out of control in lots of ways. So I think we have some serious questions that we need to confront here, and these are questions that we must face on a system-wide societal level, not with respect to individuals. And I think the challenge then becomes, how do we reorient or rebalance, or whatever the word is, these technologies away from just creating individuals who care only about their own individual everyday lives or their own personal individual energy use, but are prepared to ask bigger questions about where is it that we as a society are going, and is that desirable, and what's my role in that, and what might I do differently, and so on. How might I engage beyond just looking at my smartphone, for instance? And so some of the work that I think has got a lot of promise in that sort of direction is some of the work coming out largely, often from designers who are involved in playfully engaging in developing technology in different kinds of ways. And I'm very inspired by some of the work around what they call ludic design or disruptive design that Carl DeSalvo is involved in the States, which is trying to design digital smart products that don't just get people to think about themselves and their private concerns, but that open up much bigger questions. Just to give one very quick and evocative example, Carl DeSalvo has designed something called the Forget-Me-Not lamp, and it's a reading lamp, right? And the idea is normally we would have a light on when we read at night or in a chair, and the idea of the lamp is we can just forget about electricity or energy. We just have to worry about reading the book because the lamp's on, providing light all the time. But their Forget-Me-Not lamp, you put it on, and as you use more energy reading your book, it slowly closes. It looks like a Forget-Me-Not, hence the name, and it closes. The petals close around the lamp and the room gets darker, making it harder and harder to read. And it's deliberately designed, what you have to do is keep touching the lamp to open the petals up, and it's deliberately designed to continually engage you with the energy you are using just to read while sitting in a chair. And it's a really sort of silly, simple example, but what it does is encourage people to think broadly, think beyond just themselves in the chair, think beyond this idea that energy and the things that we rely upon should just be invisible and there and taken for granted, but confront bigger questions about, what we might do differently. There are lots of other examples I could talk through in this sort of area, but I think that's a particularly inspiring one, and I think the role of researchers in this debate is to open up those sorts of questions, and it is to try and, as Yolandi was saying, think about alternatives, think about doing things differently.
That's very interesting. How do you think people would feel then if they would actually opt to be more passive in their energy demand management?
You're coming back to me?
Yeah, just not heard of the Forget-Me-Not lamp.
Well, it's a good point. They could, of course, just choose not to buy that lamp or throw it out.
It's often the problem with these innovative designs.
Okay. Matt, what were your views?
Well, a range, but carrying on from where Tom left off, there's some very insightful comments there. Anyway, Tom's talking about expanding from the focus simply on one technology at a time with one user, but rather thinking about how to kind of raise the consciousness of us as users to think about what's all contributing to. That's terrific. But I would argue that, in a way, we need to move beyond that as well. That's kind of keeping with individuals and raising their consciousness, but at the more system level, at the political level, it's about recognizing that as users, often what we do is constituted to a significant extent by the technologies we have, by shared social norms, that there's a limited scope for us as individuals to change, even with a widened consciousness. So it's about the level of system design and recognizing that we need to go far beyond those individual technologies and how individuals relate to them to think about overall how we're conceiving change at the level of infrastructures as well as appliances and how that relates to the patterns of daily life. And I think it's really useful thinking about this in relation to debates about the sort of appropriate balance of individuals' lives for their well-being, which echoes back to Tom's points on whether we'd be happier if we just slowed down, did less stuff, and therefore used less energy.
That's great, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so opening it really out to system level design and thinking about infrastructures. And I guess, Nick, you work in practice, so you're kind of actively, you're at the vanguard of working with these
we are kind
heating technologies.
We are, and you know, one of the primary focuses of our work is to ensure that vulnerable groups in society, low-income groups in society, are able to capture the potential benefits from these smart technologies. And there is a concern that they might well be left behind. And so I think it's an important thing for the policy community to look at, and also for the research community, is to how to design these technological systems so that the most vulnerable in society can take advantage of them also. So it's a who wins and who loses with these disruptive technologies, and policy needs to sort of bear that in mind.
Do you think there's anything that researchers can do? What sort of questions should be asked in order to help progress the debate?
Well, there needs to be the kind of research that would be useful is actually in seeing what the impacts on energy consumption are from introducing, for instance, a smart meter technology which has a sort of related set of smart meter services around it. So the in-home display being the first and best known example, which is shortly going to become, you know, ubiquitous by the end of 2020 at least. That's the intention. And what we've found when we've put these in-home displays into people's houses, prepayment in-home displays to go with prepayment meters, is that people are able to use the sort of some of the functionality that comes with that. They can look at their credit rating, for example, and they can plan around that. But they don't use the energy efficiency functionality, the wider screens, and it's taken a kind of intervention on our behalf to train people how to use their in-home display to get the best out of the technology. So there's a question there for practitioners, I suppose, and also researchers, how to sort of wrap sort of support services around the technology so that people can get the best out of it through things like commissioning and training.
Yeah. So I guess you're experiencing that disconnect between the design of the technologies and then how people actually use those energy management technologies in the home. Really interesting to hear about, you know, opening up the debate and thinking about societal level changes and infrastructure changes, thinking beyond the individual and the specific technological widget as well. So thanks very much for all of your comments there. I'd like to open up questions now from the audience. Has anyone got any comments that they'd like to offer? We've got some roaming mics.
Thank you. Really interesting. I'm a psychologist and I research technology. And the thing that strikes me in your discussion is this is another example of technology outpacing aspects of society. Just because we can do something, should we be doing it? Can we see the unintended consequences of some new technology? Does it normalize unhelpful behaviors? And it strikes me that whether it's controlling the temperature in your home or a smartphone or wearable technology, we can do these things and they're cheap and they're accessible. What does it mean for the future? What does it mean for the behavior change? What are some of the unintended consequences that might arise from that? And I love technology, I'm not talking it down, but just because we can have these things, I don't think it necessarily follows that we should.
Thanks. Should we gather up a few questions?
Hi, some interesting papers there. I'm likely to read those a bit later. Thanks for the introduction to them. Building on really what was just raised there, a lot of the things that were raised in the papers and in your discussions were really going back to philosophy, really. What's important for being human? You know, what are we all here for? What are the important things in life? And following on from that, if you want to move into a research frame, if we want to research in this area, what should be the focus of a research? Where do we go from here? And what's the best way of researching that? It's a very complex area. I'm not sure what the answers are or even how to get to the answers.
Okay. We'll just take one more.
Okay, thank you. I'm Leela Damodran from Loughborough University, and I've spent more decades than I wish to confess researching the behavioural aspects of technology in various shapes and forms, and these days looking at the use of technology by older people. I'm fascinated by lots of things that you've said are really interesting, and they're a great series of papers. Two particular things I'd like to comment on and query, I suppose. One is, I thought it very interesting, your remarks about the lack of user involvement. Now, I think lots of us have been writing papers on this issue for a very long time in connection with computer technology. And I think one of the fascinating impacts of your papers may be that it informs workshops, roundtables, what have you, which engages with designers, the energy industry, all of the stakeholders in here, where in response to your question about what can researchers do, a primary contribution they can make is to simply be showing these consequences. I find it fascinating that you're saying 70% of time is spent telling people how to use these devices. That's the most appalling indictment on the design of them, that they're so unintuitive. And I wonder how much of that feedback reaches the designers of these things. The other is the area of abandonment of technology. Again, that's been written about for probably 3 or 4 decades. And they're the same issues about lack of user involvement means there's a poor match between user requirements and the characteristics of the technology. And it has to be the 21st century time now to begin to draw all of those things together and call to account the various activists, actors in this sphere. And I hope very much that your papers are going to be the stimulus for doing that, and I look forward to that.
Wow, that's quite a tall order. Thanks very much. Okay, we haven't got much time left, so I'll just respond the second question there, which was sort of, we have touched on, I guess, what's the focus for research now? And yeah, these are philosophical questions, maybe there's larger societal level questions. It is complex, and so yeah, what kind of pointed areas can research address here? What questions can they ask? Yeah. So going to the first question then, the unintended consequences of digital technologies. And certainly some of the papers talk about how digital energy management technologies, for instance, can actually reinforce levels of energy use. So would anybody like to take that question?
Well, just to start off with a pedantic point, to me, you can't talk about technology outpacing society because technology is society. Technology is a result of social activity, it shapes social activity. So I think it's really important, it is a pedantic disciplinary point in a way, but I think it's really important to recognize that technology is actually part of society, not somewhere else that we can slow down. In terms of how it's currently framed, obviously the way that we get technology ends up that it's up to individuals to work out how it fits into their lives, how to make it functional to themselves, and it comes down to philosophical debates about who is responsible for deciding what should be out there, who's responsible for deciding whether or not consumers should have those options to take hold of the commodities that are offered them by the market. So,
yeah. I think, yeah, there's just sort of picking up on that. There's big tech companies out there. I mean, I love tech as well, but there's the Siemenses of the world. They're the IBMs of the world. They're furiously innovating in this space, and they've got a lot of tech that they want to get into our cities and into our communities. And I think there's a kind of danger that unless the sort of policy community kind of get a grip on it, this tech will become kind of almost imposed upon people, and we'll end up in a situation where we're kind of being, well, there's the panopticon kind of metaphor for this, that we're perhaps being watched, we're perhaps being manipulated in ways that are not particularly democratic. So that's sort of one path that this technology could take. I'm thinking about the sort of smart city type idea. So it's kind of incumbent on the policy community to sort of to take a grip of the situation, I suppose, in a way, and ensure that the way that these technologies do become integrated and embedded in society is in a way which is positive and sort of promotes democracy, promotes kind of informed decision making, and is a kind of tech for good rather than a tech for kind of manipulation.
Okay.
Otherwise it just becomes another commodity that we have to be convinced by the advertising community that we need.
Yeah.
And there should be a sort of standard that says if there hasn't been user-centered design, it doesn't go onto the shelves. Why should we be forced to take something that actually is proven to just be irrelevant?
Great. So I noticed that Rosie's loitering in the wings there. So I think we've reached the end of our allotted time. I'd like to really thank the panel very much, and the audience as well, for all your questions. And please do have a look at the working papers online.